my name is William James. I'm the host of The Bald Book Geek. Let's talk about the Hobbit movies. Now, the Hobbit movies have a long and troubled history in production, and I feel like going into them and just talking about them because I am actually quite kind to the Hobbit movies, but for reasons that will become apparent as this video goes on. So, what's the history? Guillermo del Toro, the man himself, was originally on to direct, and Peter Jackson was going to work as the producer, executive producer, and so on. Now, this has come from different sources, so I'm not 100% sure on how true any of this is. This has just come from leaked information that I found online over the last few months. The Hobbit Trilogy was originally going to be 2 films, and they were going to be framed around a story being told to a group of children. And that the framing section of the story would have been in the style of the Lord of the Rings movies, the Peter Jackson films. Then the story would have been presented in kind of the imagination of the children listening to the story being read to them. It would have been stylistically very different from the Lord of the Rings films. Now, rumour, studio interference and other stuff that happened backstage and some delays led to him walking away from the project. Although a lot of his designs are still left in there, and he does get a credit in the film anyway, so I think that's quite an interesting one to note. Now, what happened was the studio itself wanted a prequel to the Lord of the Rings. They didn't want The Hobbit. The Hobbit as a novel is not the prequel to The Lord of the Rings, despite featuring a few characters, a mention of a certain bad guy, briefly, although he wasn't the bad guy when it was originally written, and a magic ring, and a golem. So, what happened? Now, I've always said this. The Hobbit movies, I like the tone of them. I think they are far better than people give them credit for, but I do agree that they take a lot of liberties with The Hobbit, and they definitely shoehorn in a lot of Lord of the Rings stuff. They shoehorn in a lot of the stuff from the appendices, which I find very interesting. There is a lot in there that goes over people's heads when they say it's not the book on screen. I would have preferred Guillermo del Toro's vision of The Hobbit over what we got. Also, the frame rate is an issue with me and The Hobbit. I went to see the first one in the cinema and I felt dizzy. I'm very bad with high frame rates and very bad with 3D, so not a good mixture for me. It was not a pleasant experience. Cut to me falling over and throwing up. I'm not kidding. And then a 3-day migraine. Now, because of the change in frame rate, they couldn't use a lot of the stuff that was built for the Lord of the Rings, so they had to rebuild new CGI effects. The problem is you end up with rubber hobbits. Although I will say this, the CGI is not nearly as bad as the Rings of Power. And at least it feels like talking. Now, the story of The Hobbit is presented there. And that's something I will say. The story of The Hobbit is presented in these films with a hell of a lot added in, a lot of appendices stuff, some stuff from his notes and other things. It's a very bizarre pitch-podge of several different sources, all squished together. On the other side of it, I think the casting was very good. I will give credit where credit's due. The casting, I think Martin Freeman was genius. And I think that was just perfect. I think that was honestly the most perfect casting for that role. What I do find interesting is when you look at what Guillermo del Toro envisioned, I do wonder how it would have looked. Would it have been kind of the gothic, sugary thing that he's created, or would it have been other things? I do wonder how it would have looked. I wonder what the effects would have been like, and I do wonder what the film would have flowed like, because I think The Hobbit retold in that way would have worked far better than what we got. But like I said, the main studio wanted a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, and not its own thing, and I think that was the downfall of them. I also think they tried to recapture the magic of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I get, because again, cash cow. And what I will say is that you can't recapture magic. Things have to stand on their own, and they definitely emulated the Lord of the Rings trilogy in moments. I think the scenes with, great actors and some good writing, but it did miss that magic, and it's a shame. So I do wonder what Guillermo del Toro's Hobbit would have looked like, felt like. I only will say that I wish it had been made that way. Like, I look at those leaks and those images and stuff like that, and I do wonder. I think the studio made a huge mistake with the Hobbit movies trying to emulate the Lord of the Rings. I think trying to recapture that was just not what they should have done and just let it stand on its own. But it's a shame that they didn't. And again, ideas, concepts. Guillermo del Toro's brain is rather amazing. And like I said, I wonder what it would have been, how it would have done. And I do wonder, and I say this, would they have been better received by critics instead of emulating the Lord of the Rings and kind of standing on their own?